Welcome to the FY26 Insights Webinar. The big news is that Australia enters the new financial year as a fragile nation. Never before have Australians been so distrusting. We're facing persistent distrust in key sectors, economic uncertainty, and widening social divides. In this climate, distrust isn't just a problem, it's the unyielding barrier to recovery. Now, shortly, we'll explore a range of issues impacting the coming 12 months in a lively Q&A with Nine's finance editor, Chris Kohler. But first, former diplomat Alan Renouf famously said in his 1979 book, The Frightened Country, that Australia risked becoming a frightened and intimidated nation. Fast forward to our current decade of distrust, and his warning appears to be a reality. Roy Morgan data confirms that we've become a fragile nation. Distrust in the entire economy is rising. Confidence is low, and the very social fabric of our nation is experiencing unfamiliar, sustained stress. This slide serves as a timely reminder. Handle your reputation with care, because distrust makes everything fragile. Now, we're Roy Morgan, so the evidence matters. Before COVID, Australians trusted the economy, companies, government, institutions, more than they distrusted it. See the black net trust line, which is trust minus distrust. The pandemic marked a tipping point, plunging net trust into deep net distrust territory. Two key insights emerge. First, COVID exposed and amplified existing weaknesses in institutional trust, permanently altering how Australians judge institutions, brands, and leaders. Second, a distrusting public becomes inherently risk-averse, spending less, saving more, and doubting every institution, effectively stalling economic momentum. Just look at these iconic Australian brands, Qantas, Optus, Coles and Woolworths. I'll return to this slide shortly, but it's worth noting that before COVID, they were widely trusted. However, each of them suffered a dramatic brand shock, customer data breaches, customer service failures and profit triumphalism, and their reputations plunged into net distrust territory. Each of these household names proved far more fragile than their leaders had ever imagined. This chart makes the public mood crystal clear. The tiny green bars show a handful of Australians who say, I trust a company because it makes profit. And that's largely shareholders and a few employees. But look at the towering red columns, or deep spikes. They represent the many Australians who explicitly distrust brands for being too motivated by profit, especially when household budgets are under intense pressure. For any company operating in a cost of living crisis, the takeaway is simple. If customers feel you're winning at their expense, distrust spikes, and it's a spike that it's really hard to recover from. To help unpick these trends, it's now my pleasure to welcome Chris Kohler, finance editor at the Nine Network and an astute observer of how economic insights play out for households and businesses alike. Chris spends his days translating statistics into stories Australians can believe in. And his nights he spends adoring his gorgeous children. Chris, what's your take on the economy now and over the next 12 months?
Yeah, Michelle, finally, it's the year of the rate cut. This is something that households have been waiting a really long time for. Of course, there was that big pause, and then they just skyrocketed. Now, finally, interest rates are coming down. At the start of this year, 4.35%. They've come down a long way. It's not loose monetary policy, but I think it's certainly going to help a lot.
And where do you see those rate cuts are having an effect?
Look, I think first and foremost, it's going to be in discretionary spending. You know, people being able to buy things that maybe they were putting off for a little bit. We've seen some recent figures showing some of the strongest discretionary spending figures of the year so far happening in May, and things like clothing and footwear are coming back into people's minds. The idea maybe that they could go on a holiday or do something that they maybe thought previously was a little bit too extravagant given the economic circumstances. I think also house prices, of course, and just kind of a little bit less stress on
A little bit
households.
less stress, yeah. And what about the economy as a whole? It's kind of been stuck, hasn't it? It's really been stuck for a couple of years now. What do you think it needs to get it moving again?
Look, interest rate cuts will be, that'll be big. I think time really is what I think on that one. If we keep seeing interest rates coming down, as a lot of economists think that we will, the unemployment rate's still pretty low, and that sentiment is going to keep on ticking higher. I think that's what really gets things moving. Of course, what we need to keep an eye on is small and medium businesses. We don't really have an engine room of the economy without them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, good point. And I guess as we saw inflation, interest rates falling, so that's great. We're seeing retail spendings increasing. The economy appears to be growing, but we just can't get consumer confidence to increase. We just can't get people to feel more confident. The ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Index shows confidence languishing well below the neutral 100 mark for 3 straight years. That's the longest and deepest stretch we've experienced this century. Each modest uptick feels tentative, only to be followed by a sharper decline. And in May, we were still stuck in the 80s. That's a worrying sign. Low confidence isn't just a mood swing. It feeds a self-reinforcing cycle in which households pull back on discretionary spending, businesses delay new investments or hiring, and government revenues come under pressure. What's driving that negative loop isn't simply economics, it's emotional. Distrust acts like a hidden brake, turning a willing consumer into a risk-averse saver. Even as inflation eases and interest rates fall, Australians remain wary of the very institutions that they rely on: banks, governments, retailers, and so the brakes on recovery aren't released. While that continues, the broader economy will struggle to regain real momentum. So Chris, despite low consumer confidence, interest rates are falling, retail spending's improving, business confidence is growing, inflation appears to be under control. So what's it going to take to get the economy firing again?
They're all really nice things, aren't they? That kind of business confidence and the consumer confidence piece. I think to really let it soak into all of the different parts of the economy, you just have to wait a little while.
More rate cuts?
I think more rate cuts, absolutely. They'll have to keep on coming down, and most economists seem to think we can expect further interest rate cuts. And look, unemployment is still pretty low, so that job security is in people's minds and they're feeling pretty good about that. So I think if it's another few months or maybe towards Christmas, you might start to see that general sense of well-being improve. But of course, you really have to see small business as the canary in the coal mine here.
Absolutely. As you can see, over the first half of 2025, firms of all sizes have edged back into positive territory, above that neutral 100 mark. Small businesses, those turning over between $1 and $5 million, are leading the pack at 120.1, followed closely by medium and large enterprises at 119.5 and 118.9 respectively. Even micro businesses, which make up 90% of all firms, have crawled back to 101.7, over that 100. Taken together, this suggests that although everyday Australians remain cautious consumers, the business community is getting the nerve back. However, it reminds us that micro businesses, by far the largest group, will continue to exert the greatest influence on the economy's overall confidence. So, Chris, despite increasing confidence across the board, small businesses are still closing down in record numbers. This seems really counterintuitive. What do you think's going on? And how do you think this translates to the wider economy?
The thing that's most alarming to me about that is something like 10% of small hospitality businesses have closed in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
I mean, that's massive. So it's hospitality head and shoulders in terms of the risk area, and then everybody else, it seems. And I think one of the big problems here is a psychological barrier for people when they walk into one of these places. You know, a small business of any kind has had significant increase in cost across the board, whether it's labour, energy, rent, ingredients, you name it. But there's a limit to how much we will spend as consumers on a cup of coffee or a chicken sandwich. So they're limited in how much they can pass on of the cost increase, still retain their margin, and come
survive.
out on top and survive. It was about 12 or so months ago that I interviewed T. Gezard of Ginger Boy when he was closing down Ginger Boy here in Melbourne CBD, and he said people need to get used to the idea of spending $60 for a plate of food, not at the best restaurant in town, but just a nice restaurant. And I just think that's a hurdle that's too high for people to clear right now.
Yeah. And the weakest link, obviously those hit hardest by cost of living pressures, supply chain snarls or labour shortages are these small businesses, and they simply fold. And they come out of our survey. So it's almost like a survivor bias. The small businesses that we're surveying, because they still exist, are feeling confident. But the ones that don't exist anymore, they fall out of the survey. So it's a really interesting situation, and it makes business confidence look a little more positive than perhaps it would be if we were including everyone.
Well, that's an interesting observation. I hadn't really thought about that, because I know, it takes a while for a business to go under. It's a slow and painful process.
Yes.
And then once they do, they're out of the survey.
They're out of the survey. They don't exist anymore. And it's a really interesting point, because it kind of says we're measuring, or we're getting to the pockets of resilience, the ones that have actually survived. And there's probably accelerating fragility in other areas, those that are just not making it.
What do you think about the idea that they're still opening these businesses? I do walks around the city sometimes. I'm stunned at how many new hospitality places are popping up, despite that really high rate of closure. What do you think about the optimism there?
I think there's a level of optimism in some small pockets with people who see opportunities. And you have to say, we know that there are still people spending money and happily spending money. So maybe there's a real changeover. And some of those places that are opening are going to fly, and others will go just the same way as the other ones, I think. Now, Chris, we've talked previously about supermarkets quite a bit.
Yes.
And they've been accused of price gouging, engaging in what we at Roy Morgan call profit triumphalism, which just means they shout about how much profit they've made. And clearly that's good for shareholders and suppliers, and they need to do that. They're in business to stay in business for shareholders. But mums and dads struggling to put food on the table also hear them, and they're not happy about it.
I love the consumer trust data that Roy Morgan puts out for this story that's been told about the supermarkets over the last year and a half. From top of the table to bottom, I've just been loving that story that the data tells us. As for how they've been handling it all, I think, the CEOs, Amanda Bardwell and Leah Weckert, have been doing probably as best they can in the circumstances, because you're right. It's been that avalanche crisis.
Yes. One
thing after the other. It all builds on itself, to the point where you're watching on at the Woolworths AGM and you've got actual workers standing up and saying, I can't make a living here. What am I doing working for you? The public relations of it has been a nightmare, but that two-tone messaging has become a real problem. We're doing really well in front of shareholders, but don't worry, we're not ripping anybody off in front of the customers. I don't know how that kind of gets reconciled going forward. I just think they're in a bit of a pickle, because, it's now in public record that they're a bit cosy, as the government puts it after their inquiries.
Well, we're hearing from real people, aren't we? Real consumers, about how they're feeling about these things, and how that plays out. We'll have to watch, I guess.
We will.
Back now to our household brand slide. The 4 iconic Australian brands, Qantas, Optus, Coles and Woolworths. They were trusted during COVID, but then each of them suffered dramatic brand shock. Customer data breaches, customer service failures, profit triumphalism. And their scores plunged into net distrust territory. The dotted red box highlights the compounding effect. Once a brand enters distrust territory, recovery is sluggish, but more on that shortly. So what's the financial year 26 insight? When consumers are anxious about money, any misstep around price, customer focus, privacy, or integrity is magnified. Companies and institutions need to treat distrust like a balance sheet risk, because that's precisely how the markets and regulators see it. Now, changing tack now, I know you're interested in consumer credit and the rise of BNPL, buy now, pay later operators. Tell us what you think.
I think it was existing in a grey area for such a long time, 10 years, and we weren't really sure how we were treating this type of consumer credit. As of this year, I'm really happy that it's been brought under the umbrella of the Consumer Credit Act and it's being treated as it should be, in that, you or I couldn't max out our situation here at this provider and then just simply go to that one. I mean, we're talking about larger sums of money than we used to, and we're talking about buy now, pay later spreading into places that it was never really intended to be. Like, you could have a pad thai dinner tonight from your local Thai place and still be paying it off 4 installments later. I mean, that was never really the plan with this, or with essential services or products like a grocery store or fuel. Initially, that was not how it was supposed to be treated, and now it's almost encouraged. So I'm very cautious about this. I've spoken to the National Debt Helpline a few times about it. They say up to half of the people who call have some sort of problem with buy now, pay later debt that's swirling around and kind of caught up with them.
Yes.
So I'm glad that it's being regulated in a way that it's a bit more thoughtful than it previously was, but I just think that that's kind of a bell that's not being unrung anytime soon.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, it's regulated or at least measured and represented and understood. These things can't just exist in that grey area. Here we see a clear warning sign in the surge of buy now, pay later usage across Australia. Over the past year, the percentage of adults using buy now, pay later climbed almost 10%. And looking at recent spending on buy now, pay later, use in just the last 4 weeks, that's increased even more. In other words, 1 in 4 Australians now relies on buy now, pay later at least once a year. And that proportion is growing for recent spending. While it can feel like a convenient short-term fix, rising buy now, pay later adoption often masks deeper financial stress. Users sometimes carry multiple outstanding BNPL balances, have higher overall unsecured debt, and cut into savings just to make the next instalment. As these services expand into essential purchases, like groceries to utilities, this spike in personal debt threatens both household resilience and broader consumer demand. It's another canary in the coal mine for financial fragility, and one more indicator that despite signs of economic recovery, many Australians remain one payday or one unexpected bill away from real hardship. We talk a lot about mortgage stress, and analysis of Roy Morgan data on mortgage stress and buy now, pay later spending shows among Australians classified as extremely at risk of mortgage stress, recent buy now, pay later spending has jumped 40% over the last 3 years. The fact that those most at risk of mortgage stress are turning to buy now, pay later tells a worrying story. Rising rates and living costs are pushing homeowners beyond their budget, and buy now, pay later has become a short-term fix, one that typically compounds their financial pressure over time and erodes consumer confidence across the economy. Finally then, let's look at credit cards, another key indicator of household stress. And over the past 12 months, the total amount of rolled over credit card debt has lifted by 5.6% to $8.26 billion in May 2025. The extra $440 million that people carry month to month represents real pain. Higher interest costs, reduced discretionary spending, and knock-on impacts for retailers and lenders alike. It also tells us that as living costs bite, more Australians are relying on high-cost credit just to keep pace. So rising buy now, pay later use and growing credit card revolver balances together paint a really worrying picture of household finances under strain. One more reason why restoring trust in institutions and reducing the need for precarious debt has never been so urgent. Are you surprised at that kind of personal debt growth?
I would love to say yes. Unfortunately, no. These sorts of consumer debt products have just become so available. You can be approved instantaneously. Look, the one thing to say here is that buy now, pay later, for all of its problems, is probably a bit better than credit card debt. Rolling that over month to month at a 22 or 25% interest rate is pretty catastrophic, really. The fees you pay on buy now, pay later are lower. One of the problems I think about buy now, pay later that doesn't get talked about that much is the merchant fees on businesses. They're about 4%, which is significantly higher than it is for a credit card or debit card purchase. So the businesses are forking out here too. So the sort of the expansion and growth in buy now, pay later is costing money to the economy in a few different ways.
Just taking another slice, isn't it? Another
it's a big
slice.
price. You know.
Yes.
These small businesses are kind of having to swallow it, pass it on. The buy now, pay later services don't really want you to pass it on. So you know that's sort of a challenge here. How do we figure that out? I don't know, but no. To answer your question, I'm not surprised because it's so readily available, and people who are struggling to manage their household budget, they now have it at their disposal.
It's a way to buy things. Yeah. So you and I, quite separately, have talked about the AI revolution and how it's sweeping the business world. What I've seen is that people are becoming increasingly distrustful of companies that are perceived to overly rely on AI, changing more to AI. All those irritating chatbots and those kinds of things that we find. Seems that we're still, as human beings, more comfortable with companies that balance a kind of human insight with AI. Who do you think is really at risk from AI?
Jobs-wise?
Yes, in any way you like. Yeah. Who's at risk? And who do you think is benefiting?
Look, I think big businesses are benefiting, if I can go with that one first. I talked to some of the executives of big organisations that have to be customer facing, and they're pretty quickly and fairly quietly talking about how testing is showing that people who are interacting with their chatbots are happier than when they interact with the people that they put on the other end of the line, and they're paying attention to that. Yeah. They're going to start moving in that direction with those sorts of results in hand. So I think big businesses are going to be using it, and we're going to be dealing with those chatbots a bit more regularly. As for who's going to be losing out, I mean, it's really interesting, I think, from a historical perspective, every industrial revolution that we've seen has mostly been punctuated by blue-collar workers or factory workers losing some of their responsibilities and maybe even their jobs. But now it seems like this, you know, ChatGPT and all of those sorts of AI bots, it's kind of coming more for the white-collar part of the world.
Yeah.
You know, you can get a pretty good summation of what tax situations you're heading for.
The knowledge workers, as they call them, you know, people who know something.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the idea that it's coming for absolutely every job, I don't know about that, but I think a lot of the fairly cozy, maybe legal and accounting areas are maybe heading for a little bit of trouble. We just had a baby earlier this year. I don't think any midwives or any of those sorts of jobs are in any trouble from AI. But I think that it's going to be massive, and I think it's going to be coming for people who have worked a long time and to get very educated and professional.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Sadly, Chris, we're going to have to wrap this up. But before we do, we can't close without at least touching on Donald Trump and his tariff wars and the real wars in Gaza and Ukraine. How do you think all of this unrest, this kind of global unrest and global violence is going to impact us here in Australia over the next 12 months, say?
Yeah, well, aside from it being very distressing to watch on, look, I cover financial markets a bit. I was stunned and very busy in early April, when Donald Trump unveiled the kind of those huge tariffs and the plans for them. The markets collapsed very quickly, but then they recovered very quickly.
Yeah.
You know, now they're at record highs, both here and overseas. So the thing that's happened is that we've had uncertainty. Maybe people's superannuation portfolios haven't actually lost the dollars and cents yet, but it's just this sense of absolute uncertainty right now. And I think that's going to be a bit unpleasant over the next few years. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't think anyone does. But I read it really nicely put in the Chanticleer column the other day, is when you have, you know, trillions of dollars wiped off and then piled back on in the space of 6 weeks, someone's going to get hurt. And I worry a bit about retail investors here in this environment too.
So, Chris, thank you. I don't want to stop. We could keep talking for another hour. But stop we must. Thank you for being so generous with your time and those wonderful insights.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Michelle.
Looking back over this conversation, the common thread is unmistakable. Where distrust rises, progress stalls, whether that's household spending, workplace productivity, or shareholder value. Yet fragility is not fate. Our data shows the organisations that act early, measuring distrust, pinpointing its drivers and responding with the right approach, recover faster and emerge stronger. So I'll leave you with 3 practical next steps. First, detect early. Track distrust with the same discipline you give to revenue or market share, and review it every month for early warning signals. Second, respond decisively. The moment a distrust gap appears on price, profit, privacy, or customer focus, move first, explain clearly, and close that gap fast. Third, build resilience by embedding trust metrics into executive goals and bonuses. Only Roy Morgan delivers the monthly early warning benchmark recovery trajectories and customises strategies that turn distrust intelligence into a competitive advantage. And that's a wrap. For more in-depth analysis of trust and distrust, subscribe to the Roy Morgan YouTube channel or visit your online store. Again, my thanks to Chris Kohler for his valuable contribution. See you next time.